153 fish. But why? Well, hello again. Welcome to another video. Today we are answering a Bible question, and the question on the table is, in the Gospel of John, talking about the book, not the derivative YouTube channel. In the Gospel of John, Jesus leads his disciples to catch 153 fish. Question is there any significance that we should attach to the number 153? That is, why did they catch 153? Why not 152? Why not 154? Why not 250? So, should we attach any significance at all to that number? And I think it's a good question. The reason why I think it's a good question is because, simply, it's in the Bible. The passage that we're talking about is found in the 21st chapter of John. And if we go take a look, let's see here. Verse 11. Simon Peter went up and hauled the net to land full of large fish, 153. And, although there were so many, the net was not torn. So again, why 153 fish? The very first thing that I'll say, the reason why we're even making a video on the point, is that I think there is some validity to the question. Some people might say, well, who cares, right? Does that radically affect your faith? Why would we even fixate on that? Who cares? What does it matter? Just move on. And we can certainly run with that if that's where you're at. I'm sure there are other great videos on YouTube that will capture your attention. I won't be offended. But the reason why I think that the question is worthy of spending some time on is that, as I said, the number 153 is in the Bible. It's in the text of John chapter 21. And as Christians, we believe that Scripture is God-breathed. All Scripture is God-breathed, authored by a perfect and inerrant God. And since Scripture was written by a perfect and inerrant God, then every word of Scripture is in there for a reason, right? We can't just conclude, oh, you know what God's like. Sometimes he gets going and he gets really wordy and he goes into a whole bunch of detail that he really doesn't need to. No, he's perfect and inerrant. So no, he doesn't get overly wordy. Every word of Scripture is there for a reason. Every word of Scripture is conscious and deliberate on his part in order to convey some specific revelation to us as reader. Now, all of that being said, though, we do need to do our homework as reader to understand what is written and to not mishandle what is in the text. Sometimes people can wander off track in the pursuit of taking Scripture, interpreting Scripture, trying to understand and apply it. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about from this very passage, in the 4th century, Jerome taught on this passage of Scripture, and he taught that the 153 fish were symbolic of the gospel going out to 153 nations, which it's one of those things that, well, that sounds kind of cool at face value, that, hey, that's neat. He's prophesying here about the gospel going out to the world. But I think there are a couple of issues with an idea like that of extracting that type of meaning from this type of passage. For the first thing I would say on that interpretation is that the recognition of nations around the world is a subjective thing. If you go around the world today and you look at different nations, if you look at the world through the lens of different nations, different places will affirm different numbers of countries in the world. So if we hold fast to this 153 number, you could say, well, 153 from whose perspective? Whose lens are we looking through here? And I guess if we're reading scripture, the obvious answer would be, well, God's lens, I guess. Well, okay, so that's an answer, but present day 2021, the United Nations currently affirms, I think it's 195 different nations. So that kind of presents us with another problem. Are we saying that God doesn't recognize 40 or so nations that the United Nations does recognize? And if so, should we be concerned about that? Should we be trying to figure out which 40 we have a discrepancy with between God and the United Nations? Or is God actually saying that he recognizes all the nations of the earth, but the gospel won't go out to 40 of them, which is kind of even more concerning, I guess. So I get, and rather than, digging into that and trying to answer those questions, I think that's kind of my point, is that running with an interpretation like that really poses more questions than it poses answers. It just kind of throws out implications and problems that I don't know that the text is really intended to throw out for us. But the second thing, and I would say this is probably an even bigger issue from the perspective of the Bible text. If we can read this verse here, verse 11, as the catching of fish, I guess, is the sharing of the gospel, and the fish itself, I guess, represents nations in the world. If that's how we can interpret those terms in the text, then my concern is that anything can mean anything, right? Right? I mean, if the fish refers to the gospel going to the nations, well, why can't it refer to 153 flavors of ice cream? Right? Because anything can mean anything if that's how we choose to interpret the words. Like there's literally zero connection between the words written on the page and the meanings that we are attaching to those words. It's an interpretive method that's just made up, right? There's no connection there. And that would be my bigger issue, is how we actually interpret the text, the rules that we employ to interpret text and derive meaning from text. So, all of that said, what is going on here in John chapter 21? What meaning can we draw from the text, from the 153 fish, that gives us something to talk about, because I'm sure that's what God intended, but yet remains faithful to the text and doesn't perform interpretive gymnastics to get us to an intended meaning? Well, as we often do, it's probably a good idea to back up a little bit and look at some of the context that's going on in and around this passage. So as we probably are aware, this passage of scripture is going on after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If we go here to, let's jump back up to the beginning of the chapter here. Yeah, that works. And I think what's going on here, as I said, it's after the death and the resurrection of Jesus. We're looking kind of through the eyes of the disciples here, and particularly for Peter, I think the word of the day here in this passage is failure. And it's kind of a multifaceted failure that is on Peter's mind and heart here at the beginning of this chapter. Let me explain what I mean by that. Firstly, we have Jesus, right? And Jesus was not so long ago bringing crowds of people, thousands of people, to hear him teach, to receive physical healing, to demonstrate various signs of miracles. And Peter was a part of all that. He was close by. He witnessed all of these amazing things being in the presence of Jesus. But then Jesus was nailed to a cross and died at the hands of the Romans. And so Peter, I think, here is at best confused, but at worst, he probably is concluding that the entire ministry of Jesus has just failed. It's just come to an end. The passage that I think of here, that this makes me think of, if we jump to Matthew chapter 16 here, earlier, obviously, in Jesus's ministry, and so this is where we see we see Peter confessing Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, which was this was a good moment for Peter. Like he called out who he thought Jesus was, and he was right. This is a good moment for Peter, and it lasts for all of about 30 seconds because then he messes up again. So verse 21, we see the text says, "From that time Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and to suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and to be killed, and to be raised up on the third day." Verse 22, "And yet Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you.' But," verse 23, "but he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's purpose, but men.'" Or men's, rather. I smiled there as I was reading the passage, because there's some bizarre irony here that I don't know if Peter really caught, because in the passage above that we looked at just briefly, so there's Peter proclaiming Jesus as the Son of the living God. Well, great job, Peter. You've got that. That's a lot of people don't figure that out, Peter, and you've got it, so that's good. And then immediately, like 5 verses later, the text says that Peter rebukes him. Well, and I think actually, without jumping into this passage in too much detail, but I think that is the issue that Jesus kind of addresses with him when he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Just as a general rule for any human being, whenever you come to recognize someone as the Son of the living God, you shouldn't be rebuking them, because they know more things than you do. So if they say something and it sounds wrong, it's because you don't understand, right? So I think that's where Peter gets off the rails here in this passage, you don't get to rebuke the Son of the living God. That's not what we're, it's above our pay grade, let's put it that way. But I think the issue here in the passage, as we see Peter rebuking Jesus, Jesus is telling the disciples that he's going to die, and Peter argues with him. I don't think Peter really thought that he knew the future better than Jesus did, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, I don't, when Peter argues, or Peter rebukes Jesus, I don't think the basis of his rebuke is him saying, Jesus, I think you might be off base here, buddy. I don't know if you're really understanding how this is going to play out. Maybe you don't know the Old Testament scriptures well, right? I don't think that's the direction that Peter was going with the rebuke. I think what's happening here in Matthew chapter 16 is Peter is misunderstanding in that he's automatically equating physical death with the end and with failure. So Peter is rebuking Jesus here, not because he thinks he knows better than him, but because he's thinking that Jesus is just buying into negative, pessimistic talk, right? He thinks that Jesus is just basically down in the dumps here and saying, oh, none of this is going to work out. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. And that's how Peter's hearing it, that Jesus is just talking of failure. So Peter's attempt to rebuke Jesus is intended to be like a pep talk. He's saying, come on, Jesus, don't be like that. Chin up, look on the bright side. This it's going to go better than you think, right? That's, I think, Peter's take on this, was Jesus talks about going and suffering persecution and dying. Peter's hearing a morale issue, right? He's confused, and he's confused because he's assuming that death is the end, is failure. So fast forward to actual dead Jesus, and I think Peter here is still confused. He's still seeing that death equals end equals failure, that this whole earthly ministry of Jesus, this calling, all of the things that they did, it just went nowhere. It just went nowhere, and now Peter's here back in the fishing boat, right? It accomplished nothing, and they went nowhere. But beyond that, on top of the perceived failure of Jesus, you have the absolute failure of Peter. If we run back a bit to John chapter 13 here, this is John 13, and so this is the Lord's Supper, the Upper Room Discourse. Jesus talks about his coming betrayal. And so Jesus is starting to talk about going away here. And Peter says, verse 36 of John chapter 13, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay my life down, or I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus replies, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. So we have some bold talk from Peter here that I'm sure many of us are familiar with these events. Jesus tells Peter, oh, you're going to abandon me. You're not going to lay your life down for me. And we know that Peter did abandon Jesus. He did deny Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus here said that he would. And even that failure on the part of Peter was multifaceted, because Jesus had been presented as some sort of revolutionary, which was, I guess, part of the plot to have him put to death in the first place, was let's paint this guy as a revolutionary because revolutionaries are dangerous. Revolutionaries need to die. And Peter, being a follower of a revolutionary that needed to die, that's a dangerous gig, right? You don't want to be connected to the political the political revolutionary that was just executed. That's a dangerous place to be. So on one level, on a purely earthly, natural level, Peter made a smart choice to get out of the way there. If we just take spiritual, theological things out of the equation, and if we just look at the world through a humanitarian, practical sense, Peter rather, made not a stupid choice to not be around to put some distance between himself and the guy who is being put to death. But on another level, of course, Peter knew that he had failed Jesus in the most fundamental way. Of course, I mean, that's pretty much undeniable here. But thirdly, in Peter's mind, maybe these things are all connected. Maybe if Peter hadn't failed, then maybe Jesus wouldn't have failed either. Maybe Jesus would still be here with us. Now, of course, that idea is flatly untrue. We know from the Bible that it was the plan of God that Jesus would go to the cross, and in going to the cross would atone for the sin of humanity. But I'm just putting on my Peter perspective here, this confusion, this regret that he's living with at the moment, and coupled with, I guess we can say, I don't think this is unfair to say, coupled with Peter's tendency to jump to some bizarre conclusions, I think we can say. Maybe you have Peter here thinking to himself, man, when I had my knife out in the garden, my fish paring knife that he was holding, I should have just kept swinging, right? I could have saved him. I could have been the hero, and Jesus would be here, and he'd be thanking me for my heroics, and I think we've all played these types of mental games of all the amazing heroic things that we could have done to save the day. But definitely failure is on the menu here for Peter here, and so he decides, let's go back to 21, he decides, I'm going to get back in the boat and I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to do what I did before, and I'm just going to continue with it, I guess. So away they go. The text says they go out at night. It was actually quite common in the day for fishermen to fish at night. The reason for that, should you be super, super interested, the reason for that is at night fish couldn't see the nets. During the day they could see the nets and they would swim around out of the nets. Present day 2021, we have nets made out of nylon, so fishermen usually fish during the day, but it was quite uncommon for people to fish at night. It says they were out all night, verse 3, and they caught nothing. They are on their way back into shore. Jesus is standing there on the shore, and he says to them, verse 5, you don't have any fish to eat. And then Jesus says to them, cast the net on the right side and you'll find the fish. And they do that. It says they catch so many fish they can't haul it in. And then John realizes, hey, this is Jesus. Now, consider here that the boat is close enough to shore at this point that the men are able to have a conversation with Jesus. They were able to hear Jesus when he spoke, which means that they are presumably in quite shallow water, which makes it all the more amazing that they catch this huge haul of fish, because they're likely in pretty shallow water at this point. But if we look at Peter's reaction here, one of my favorite parts of this whole passage is Peter's reaction here, realizing that they are speaking with Jesus. If you disagree with me that Peter is confused at this point in time, well, I present to you the next couple of verses from John chapter 21. So we know from the text here, Peter is it says he's stripped down because he's working in the boat, obviously. And so they realize that it's Jesus on the shore. And so Peter puts on his outer tunic in order to jump into the water to swim to Jesus. So he gets dressed in order to jump into the water. Like, who does that? Why are you putting on your outer garment so that you can plunge into the water? Nobody does that. That doesn't make sense. But then top it off with the other disciples. They just continue in the boat because they're quite close to land. So you've got Peter essentially putting his coat on, so he dives into the water, and the rest of the guys are like, okay, Peter, but I guess we'll just continue rowing the boat since we're in a boat and we're almost to land anyway. Right? So Peter's just spinning in circles here, right? He's not making any sense, which is kind of great because it just kind of reveals where he's at, right? This is not the most rational, logical moment of his life. He's just spinning, right? But if we talk about Jesus, you've got Peter wrapped up in this failure and this confusion that he's processing. And Jesus, in a sense here, jogs Peter's memory. He says, hey, Peter, remember all the way back to the beginning. Remember all the way back to, let's say, Luke chapter 5, because, I mean, I'm sure Peter had his Bible with him. I'm kidding, of course. But if you think back to Luke chapter 5, when Jesus and Peter had first met, remember that time when you were out in the boat and you hadn't caught fish all night, and I told you to put out the nets, and remember you could barely haul in the catch of fish? Remember that, Peter? And that was a while ago now, wasn't it? So I want you to remember that, Peter. I want you to remember that happened. And yeah, I went to the cross, right? I died, but I'm here now. And look at that catch of fish you have right now, Peter. So the first question, how compromised am I, Peter? Because I could give you the fish. I could give you more fish than you could carry back then, and I could give you more fish that you can carry right now, having died and yet still being here. How compromised am I, Peter? How compromised are my plans? You know, do you see a broken man before you? Keeping in mind that you saw me nailed to a cross, and yet I'm still here. That's pretty amazing. But am I a broken man, or am I basically the same? Because back then, what I showed you in Luke chapter 5 is that I'm not really bound by physical constraint. And I tried really hard, Peter, to show that to you while we walk together, that physicality doesn't really slow me down. I do what I do. I do the will of the Father. I have a plan and I do that. And physical, natural things don't really get in my way. And I kept showing you that. And now I've died, but I'm still here and I'm still showing you the same message, the same lesson. I'm still not bound by physical constraint, Peter. That's what I'm trying to show you. But the second thing here, let's jump back to John chapter 29. So they've got this amazing catch of fish here in the net. There's a small detail here, but I think it's a good one. So the disciples, we know they hadn't caught any fish all night until Jesus kind of came along and helped them. So they've only just started to bring this haul of fish in, right? They've only just caught fish, and yet when they come ashore, verse 9, what's Jesus doing? well, he's already got a fire going. He's already got bread and fish. So if lesson one was that Jesus is not constrained by physicality, by physical constraints, he's not constrained by death, he's not limited by death at all. I think lesson number two here is that he also doesn't need you, Peter, or your charity, right? Jesus doesn't tell them, bring the boat in and then bring some of that fish over here. I'm starving. Come on, hook me up with some of your fish. I'm really, really hungry. They come ashore. Jesus is way ahead of them. His fish is already cooked on the fire, right? Where did Jesus' fish come from? Well, presumably the same place the fish in the nets came from. It's not really an issue for Jesus. He's not constrained by physicality, and he doesn't need you to share with him so that he can do the things that he wants to do. But so now Jesus talks to Peter, and I forgot the 153. The title of the video was to talk about the 153 fish, and we skipped right by it. So back to where we're looking, verse 11 here. I apologize. So it says they hauled in 153 fish. The significance of the 153, I will say, I don't think there's any specific significance to the number 153. Like, why wasn't it 152? Why wasn't it 154? I don't think it matters. I don't think there's any particular significance to the number itself. Sometimes numbers in the Bible do have symbolic significance to them within the text. I'm not aware of anything related to the number 153. I think the impact of the number here is that it conveys to us that they counted the fish, right? That they counted the fish in order to know that there was 153. And why did they count the fish? Well, it wasn't normal practice for fishermen to count fish. Normally, fish were sold based on weight. So why did they spend time counting how many fish were in the nets? Well, let me offer an analogy to you, which I think answers the question for us. You may not know it to look at me now, but a few years ago when I was younger, I used to run quite a lot. I used to run relatively competitively. So if you think about, for example, a 10,000 meter race, I've run 10,000 meters, honestly, more times than I can remember. I wouldn't even know how many times I've run that distance. A lot. Many. I wouldn't even hazard a guess as to how many times. And I've run that distance in competitive races at various different events, different locations, different times of the year, various different situations. I've done it a lot. So I don't remember a lot of the details around that, around how many times I ran it, where, when, who I was with. Don't remember a lot of that stuff. But you know what I do remember? I do remember my absolute personal best. My best time that I ever ran the 10,000 meters. I know what that time is. I know roughly when I did it, and I know exactly where I did it. And so I think, personally, that is the sense of the number 153 in verse 11. I don't know if 153 was literally their personal best catch of fish ever, but I think what the presence of the number in the text is there to convey to us is that when they brought the catch of fish in, it looked impressive enough to them, experienced fishermen, that they were interested enough to make the effort to count the fish. It was a significant enough haul that when they brought it in, they said, wow, there's a lot of fish here. I wonder how many fish this is. And at some point, they're like, why don't we count? Why don't, like, this is, it's so cool that there's no tangible benefit to them knowing how many fish. It's not like they can sell them for more if they know the exact number. It doesn't make any difference. But it's significant enough to them. It's interesting enough to them. It's cool to them to the extent that they're like, oh, let's count them. Let's figure out how many. Right? That's the sense of it. It's a bit like today you go fishing, you catch an average fish. I'm just talking about fishing for fun, not as a commercial fisherman. You catch an average fish, whatever, caught a fish. That's nice. Better than not catching a fish, but no big deal, right? But if you catch a huge fish, well, then you go looking for a tape measure or something, some means, you take a picture or whatever, some means of like showing people, look at this fish that we caught, right? It's because it's significant, because it's not normal. It's impressive enough that it made them want to count out the catch and note the number. So now Jesus has this conversation with Peter. He closes out this conversation here. Jesus has underlined yet again that his death and his resurrection have not limited his power, have not derailed his plan one iota. And so, given all of that, given what Jesus has revealed here, question for you, Peter. Question for you in verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, this is another interesting verse because different people have approached this verse again with some different perspectives. Some people read Jesus's question, do you love me more than these, as what Jesus is asking here is, do you, Peter, love me, Jesus, more than all of the other disciples love Jesus? Well, I don't think that's what Jesus is asking here. The reason I don't think it's what Jesus is asking is I don't think it flows naturally from the text. It's not a competition, right? If Peter is doing really, really well and he is loving Jesus, submitted to Jesus, following what Jesus has called him to do, does it really matter that he loves Jesus more than John, for example? Like I said, it's not a contest. It's not a competition. If we bring that concept forward into the present day church, should we all be focusing on competing with each other to try to love Jesus more than the person that sits next to you in church? Right? Is that what Jesus would call us to do? I just don't think it fits. I don't think it fits the text. I don't think it fits what Jesus calls people to do. I think what we should be doing in the church in 2021 is we should be encouraging one another to love Jesus more, right? The person that sits next to you in church, you should be encouraging them to love Jesus more, and you should be asking them to encourage you to love Jesus more as well. Not trying to like one up them somehow so you can talk to them about maybe taking a day off, and then you can, work on loving Jesus that day off so that you get your nose ahead of them, right? It doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't fit. Second interpretation of this passage, when Jesus asks, do you love me more than these? He's asking, do you, Peter, love me, Jesus, more than you love the other disciples? Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is theologically, that would make more sense than the first interpretation, right? Because there is some validity that we should be aiming to love Jesus more than we love the people around us. So that interpretation does make sense on that level, but I still don't think it really fits the text, because thinking back historically, has that been an issue for Peter? Is that something that Peter has struggled with, where we've seen a pattern in the life of Peter of him tending to put the other disciples ahead of Jesus in terms of Peter's loyalties? Well, Peter certainly isn't a perfect man, but no, I can't think of that happening ever, that he demonstrated love or loyalty to the other disciples over and above that which he demonstrated to Jesus. I just don't see that happening in the life of Peter, and so I don't see why Jesus would be calling him up on that point here. As I say, I don't think that flows naturally from the text either. Here's what I do think is going on here in this passage. Here's what I do think Jesus is calling Peter to in this question. As we've said, Jesus here is reminding Peter of the very beginning when they caught all these fish. And Jesus is saying to Peter back in Luke chapter 5, when they first brought in this huge catch of fish, he says to Peter, from now on, you will be catching people. And I think Jesus's point here is, we did it. Didn't we, Peter? We walked together. I told you that you would be a catcher of people, a fisher of men, as it says in the Gospel of Matthew. Didn't we do all those things? Didn't we walk together? Didn't I show you the things that I said I was going to show you? Didn't you do the things that I said you were going to do? All of that happened, right? We went out, we spread the gospel, we did it all. And then I went to the cross, but I'm still here, Peter, and you're back where you started. You're still pulling fish into a boat. And so I think what Peter is asking, I think what Jesus is asking Peter here is, what is it that you love, Peter? You've taken your ball and gone home here. You're here in a boat fishing. What is it that you love? Do you love the fishing? Or do you love me? What is it that you want to do? Do you want to be a fisher of men, like I offered to you? Or do you want to just be a fisher of fish, like you've been doing, like you're doing right now? And I think that's such a good question to ask Peter, but also to ask of anyone who proclaims to follow Christ. What is it that you love? Do you love your life? Do you love your life before you were called? Right? Remember before you received that calling from Jesus, when you just really just kind of you did what you knew, good or bad, right or wrong. You didn't have Jesus, but you followed what you knew. You did what was familiar, and it was it was simple enough. Do you love that? Do you wish you could go back to those simpler days? Or do you love Jesus? Do you want to follow him? Do you want to be a fisher of men? Because the presence of Jesus here is showing Peter, the job's still open, Peter, if you want it. So what is it that you love? Do you want to follow me, or do you want to just do what's comfortable, right? I think it's a great question for Peter. It cuts to the heart of where Peter is at this moment in time. And as I said, 2,000 years later, I think it's a great question for us in the church, not just at the beginning of ministry, not just for baby Christians, but for all of us at any point in our walk, at any point in our discipleship, to check in and ask ourselves, what is it that we love? Right? My my mind here is drifting to, I think it's Revelation chapter 2, the letter to the church at Ephesus. What had they lost? They lost their first love, right? They somehow got caught up in the stuff, and they forgot that it was Jesus that they loved, and it was the calling that he was offering. So that's our video for today. That's the 153 fish. That's what I think it means. But over and above the number of fish that were caught, I think there's just, as I said, a profound message there in the life of Peter and in the life of all of us too, to think about what's really important to us. Hope that was interesting for you. I hope that was helpful to you. If so, feel free to leave a like, leave a comment on the video if you would like. Subscribe to the channel. There should be a subscribe link down in the bottom right corner of the video. And then very last thing, if you want to contact me for questions, for discussion, for agreements, disagreements, ideas for future videos, by all means, drop me a line. thegospelofjohn@gmail.com. Thank you again for watching. Again, I hope it was helpful to you, and I will see you next time. Goodbye. God bless.